John chapter 9. John chapter 9. We're continuing our study through the Gospel according to John. Before we get started, I'd like to ask Donnie if he would lead our minds in a word of prayer. John chapter 9, we have Jesus healing the man that was born blind. And so we have here verse 6, Jesus did something that was a little out of the ordinary as far as his method of healing people. He says in verse 5 that He is the light of the world and that He is bringing those who are in darkness to light. Now He's speaking figuratively, but He's about to do it literally, and that literal opening the eyes of the blind is going to have a spiritual significance in verses 35 through 41. And so, Jesus in verse 6, after He said these things, He spat on the ground, made clay of the saliva, and He anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay. This was something that was different, but Christ could have done it any way He chose. Verse 7, and He said to him, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam," which is translated sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. So his eyes, after he washed from the pool, he came back seeing. Perhaps he was guided to the pool, or as some people who are blind from birth, they know how to get around. They know their area. He most likely was there as a beggar. They didn't have the social programs there to take care of people who were handicapped, and so they relied upon the benevolence of the people to help them out. So he might have known the area, or he may have been guided to them. But when he washed, he came away seeing. He was healed. Was there something in the water that healed him? No. Was there something in the saliva that healed him? What about the mud? No. It was God who healed him, but placed this condition on it. Just as today, Jesus said, "He that believes and is baptized shall be saved." There's nothing in the water. Christ tells us to do it. And so he went and he washed and he came back seeing. The miracle happened. Just as Naaman dipped 7 times in the Jordan River and came up the 7th time cleansed. It was God who cleansed him. It wasn't the waters of the Jordan River, but he obeyed God's will. So this man obeyed Christ and he came back seeing. Verse 8, therefore the neighbors and those who previously had seen that he was blind said, "Is this not he who sat and begged?" See, he was a beggar there, and he was looking for money because of his blindness. And they said, this is someone that we know about. This was a public miracle that was out in the open that everyone knew about. They knew him. They knew him since he was born, that he was blind. Verse 9, and some said, "This is he." Others said, "He is like him." And he said, "I am him. I am he. I am the one that was blind, and now I see." Verse 10, therefore they said to him, "How were your eyes opened?" Verse 11, and he answered and said, "A man called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and said to me, 'Go to the pool of Siloam and wash.' So I went and washed and received sight." That's the facts of the matter. That's what happened. The plain and simple facts. Verse 12, then they said to him, "Where is he?" And he says, "I do not know." So he did not go back to Jesus at that time. Didn't really have a full understanding of who Jesus was at this time. And here's something that's interesting. People say, you've got to believe in Jesus Christ, the Son of God, to receive a healing. This man didn't know exactly who Jesus was, and he received a healing. In fact, he's not going to understand who the Son of God is until Jesus says, I am that person. So the concept of, well, you got to know Jesus and believe that He is the Son of God to be healed is just blown out of the water from this chapter. He was healed by God. Verse 13. Brought him who formerly was blind to the Pharisees. Now, the Pharisees are going to have a little council here, and they're bringing this man before them, and they're really calling him on the carpet. They're upset at him, and they're upset at Jesus. And they really don't have a reason to be. But they are. We got to understand that sometimes people are going to be upset with us, and they really don't have a reason to be, but they will be. Okay. Verse 14. Now it was a Sabbath when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. Now they believe that Jesus violated the Sabbath. He did not. But according to their interpretation, He violated the Sabbath. Verse 15. Then the Pharisees also asked him again how he had received his sight, and he said to them, He put clay on my eyes, and I washed, and I see. Here again, he's recounting. Here's what happened. He put clay on my eyes, I washed, and I see. Verse 16. Therefore, some of the Pharisees said, This man is not from God, because he does not keep the Sabbath. Others said, How can a man who is a sinner do such signs? And there was a division among them. There again you see that phrase. There was a division among them about Jesus. That wasn't Jesus' fault. But there was a division about Him. And they said, the Pharisees said, This man is not from God, talking about Christ, because he does not keep the Sabbath. That is a lie. That is a false allegation. He does not keep their little traditions, because they were man-made traditions. But Jesus kept the Sabbath. And they interpreted His breaking of their traditions as being sinful. So He's a sinner. How can a man who is a sinner do such signs? Notice this. They're not denying the miracle. They can't. They're not denying the miracle at all. They're just scratching their head and saying, How can He do this? How can He do this? He's breaking the Sabbath, which is wrong. He's a sinner. That is wrong. They're not saying this miracle didn't happen. It was a genuine miracle. And there was a division among them. Verse 17. They said to the blind man again, What do you say about him? Because he opened your eyes. He said, He is a prophet. That is as far as his faith had traveled. The blind man says, This man is a prophet. Because of this. Verse 18. But the Jews did not believe concerning him that he had been blind and received his sight, until they called the parents of him who had received the sight. Now they're calling in the parents of this man. In verse 19, and they asked them, saying, Is this your son, who you say was born blind? How then does he now see? Verse 20, his parents answered them and said, We know that he is our son, and that he was born blind. Verse 21, But by what means he now sees, we do not know, or who opened his eyes, we do not know. He is of age, ask him. He will speak for himself. They're saying, He's old enough. Ask him. So they're questioning the parents. Is this your son? Was he born blind? And yes, now he sees. We don't know. But you ask him. He's old enough. Verse 22, his parents said these things because they feared the Jews, for the Jews had agreed already that if anyone confesses that he was the Christ, he would be put out of the synagogue. To be put out of the synagogue in that society means you are excommunicated. It meant you're a social outcast. Because the synagogue was the center of their life as far as their village and their worship. The children go there to get educated and things of that nature. And to be cast out of the synagogue doesn't mean, you just go down to the next synagogue. People are cast out here and you just go down to the next one in town. No, you are excommunicated from society. It was a big deal. So they were afraid of this questioning the Pharisees because they knew that they would be put out of the synagogue. 23. Therefore his parents said, He is of age, ask him. Verse 24. So they again called the man who was blind and said to him, Give God the glory. We know that this man is a sinner. So again, they are saying, we know that this man, talking about Jesus, if you notice the word man there, in most translations the M is capitalized, talking about Christ, is a sinner. They have no sin they can place on him. There is no sin that they can say he did, except they think he broke the Sabbath. But that was the allegation leveled against Christ. He's a sinner. You give God the glory. We know that this man is a sinner. Verse 25, he answered and said, Whether he is a sinner or not, I do not know. One thing I know, that though I was blind, now I see. The blind man says, I don't know whether he's a sinner or not. Here's the facts. He anointed my eyes. He told me to go wash in the pool. I came back seeing. I don't know whether he's a sinner or not. He's just stating the facts again. Verse 26, and they said to him again, What did he do? How did he open your eyes? You almost want to say, hello. He anointed my eyes with clay, told me to go wash in the pool of Siloam. I came back seeing. That's what happened. And whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know, the blind man is saying. Verse 27, he answered and said, I told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to be his disciple? Yikes. That must have cut a little bit. You want to be his disciple too? And he might have been not being sarcastic. He might have been genuine in asking the question, do you want to be his disciple? Of course, they didn't like that at all. Verse 28, Then they reviled him and said, You are his disciple, but we are Moses' disciple. See, the religious pride, they're swelling up. We are Moses' disciple. You're his disciple, but we are Moses' disciple. Jesus had already told them in chapter 8, You're of your father, the devil. And the works of your father you will do. But they still think they're following Moses. Verse 29. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as far as this fellow, we don't know where he is from. How many times did Jesus say, I've come down from heaven. I've come from the Father to do his will. How many times has Jesus said that? There was one Pharisee who was honest. Nicodemus. John chapter 3. We know that you are a man come from God, for no one can do the things which you do unless God is with him. There was an honest Pharisee. He was not a public follower of Christ at this time, but Nicodemus was saying, hey, look at the evidence. This man is from God. Now the ones who are dishonest, who don't want to really follow Christ, we don't know where he's from, they say. Verse 30. The man answered and said to him, Why, this is a marvelous thing, that you do not know where he is from, yet he has opened my eyes. He said, how can you not know where he's from? He's performed this miracle on me. Verse 31. Now we know that God does not hear sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, he hears him. So here the blind man, who seems to have more sense than the religious leaders, the Pharisees, said, look, this person healed me. How can you not know where he is from? We know God does not hear sinners. That's passages in the Old Testament that talk about that. His ears are open unto the prayers of the righteous. But we know that where he, yet you say, we don't know where he's from, yet he opened my eyes. And verse 31, if anyone is a worshiper of God and does His will, He hears him. Verse 32, since the world began, it has been unheard that anyone opened the eyes of one who was born blind. Verse 33, if this man were not from God, he could do nothing. That is the simple, logical conclusion that this very simple man, probably an uneducated man, reached. And here you have all the religious Pharisees with their education and their traditions, and they're blind. They're blind to the truth. And this very simple man is saying, look, this person couldn't have done this if he were not from God. And this person has opened my eyes. That's a miracle. And that is genuine. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. He reached the same exact conclusion that Nicodemus reached. John chapter 3. Here you have Nicodemus, an educated man, reaching that conclusion. You're from God, talking about Christ. And here you have a simple beggar reaching the same exact conclusion. Why? Their eyes were open. Their minds were receptive to the truth. What do you do when you can't answer it? Verse 34. They said to him, you are completely born in sins, and you're teaching us? And they cast him out. Literally, they excommunicated him. You were born in sin, and you're going to teach us? Why did they say that? Because of the question that was asked. Verse 1, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? The misconception that if you were born with a malady, that if you were born deformed or had a birth defect, you must have sinned somehow before you were born, or your parents sinned. And so that prevailing concept was, you were just born in sin. You're going to teach us? I was talking to a denominational preacher one time and in his office, and he got rather upset. And he said, I've been doing this for 25 years, and you're going to teach me? He could not answer the plain teaching of the Bible concerning baptism, so he resorted to insult. You're just a young whippersnapper. I've been doing this for 25 years, and you're going to teach me? That arrogance, that pride that leads to blindness. And that's a wicked attitude. And the whole process of Jesus literally opening His eyes parallels the fact that spiritually Jesus was opening the eyes to those who wanted to have their eyes opened. And the conclusion of the matter is this person is from God, and they just dismiss it. Well, you're born in sin. You're going to teach us? That religious snobbery that they have. Any question or comment before we get into the rest of the chapter? I mean, this is really, when we study the gospel accounts, we're not only studying the life of Christ, we're studying human nature. The way people act, and they're the same way today. Nothing's changed. We're a little bit more sophisticated with our technology, some 2,000 years later, but the attitude of people are still the same. Verse 35, Jesus heard that he had been cast out. And that word cast out, really cast him out, does not really capture the meaning of it. He was excommunicated. He was an outsider. He was cast out of society. It was a major thing. And when he had found him, Jesus found the man that he had given the sight to. He said to him, do you believe in the Son of God? Verse 36, he answered and said, who is he, Lord, that I might believe in him? See, he didn't have a faith yet that was up to the level of believing that Jesus was the Son of God. He was to the point of believing that he was a prophet, verse 17, which is a true statement, that he was much more than a prophet. You believe in the Son of God. Who is He, Lord, that I may believe Him? Remember, the blind man never saw Christ physically. Never saw Him. Jesus had already gone when He received His sight. He never laid eyes on Him till this time. Verse 37, Jesus said to him, You have both seen Him, and it is He who is talking with you. Then he said, Lord, I believe, and he worshipped Him. And that's the simple attitude of a humble man. Lord, tell me who He is. And Jesus says, it's I who am talking to you. I believe. And you compare that with the attitude of the religious leaders who wouldn't accept it. Who would not accept it. And it says here that he worshipped Him. And notice this. Jesus accepted it. Jesus didn't say, get up. I'm just a man. I'm just a prophet. Get up. Don't worship me. He didn't do that. Every time someone fell before Jesus and worshipped Him, He accepted it. Why? Because of what we've been studying through the book of John. He's God. Some have asked the question, should we sing songs of praise to Jesus Christ, praising Him, worshiping Him? The answer is yes. A resounding yes. Why wouldn't we? He's God. He's God's Son. And so He worshipped Him. Now, I want you to notice something. Acts chapter 10. Verse 25. Peter is going to Cornelius. Acts 10 and verse 25. When Peter entered, Cornelius met him and fell at his feet and worshipped him. Verse 26, Peter raised him up, saying, Stand up, I also am a man. He says, You don't worship me. You don't bow before me. I'm a man. Jesus never said that. Also, when you turn to the book of Revelation, Revelation chapter 22. Revelation 22. Verse 8 and 9. I, John, am the one who heard and saw these things. When I heard and saw, I fell down to worship the feet of the angel who showed me these things. Verse 9. But he said to me, Do not do that. I am a fellow servant of yours and of your brethren and the prophets and those who heed the word of this book. Worship God. The angel said, that's a powerful being. He said, You don't worship me. You worship God. So then how could we pray to a saint? A saint. Or how could we pray to Mary? When Peter says, You don't fall down and worship me. I'm just a man. And the angel said, You don't fall down and worship me. You worship God. Jesus, though, while here on earth, accepted worship. While He was in the flesh, He was still deity. And as deity, He accepted worship. Now think about this. We talked about this when we were talking about John 8. If Jesus, when He was on earth, was just a man, if He gave up His deity when He came to earth, then it would have been wrong to worship Him. Because He would have just been a creature like us. Created things are not to be worshipped. That proves, once again, He was deity, He was God in human flesh. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. John 1 and verse 14. He accepted worship. Back to verse 38, John 9 and verse 38. Lord, I believe, and he worshipped Him. Verse 39, Jesus said, For judgment I have come into the world, that those who do not see may see, and that those who see may be blind. Those who do not see might see, and those who see may be blind. What's He trying to get at? Verse 40. Then some of the Pharisees who were with Him heard these words, and He said to them, Are we blind also? Verse 41, Jesus said, if you were blind, you would have no sin. But now you say, we see, therefore your sin remains. They understood exactly what He was talking about. He came to open the eyes of the blind, and He did that physically and spiritually speaking. And that was a sign from the Old Testament Scriptures that the Messianic age, or the age of the Messiah, was upon them. Let's look at a few Old Testament passages. Isaiah 29. Isaiah 29 and verse 18. In that day the deaf shall hear the words of the book. The eyes of the blind shall see out of obscurity and out of darkness. That happened literally and spiritually speaking. Isaiah 35 and verse 5. Isaiah 35 and verse 5. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf shall be unstopped. And in those contexts there, you read that that's talking about the day the Messiah comes. That will happen. Well, now it's happening as we read John chapter 9. It's happening in the work and the ministry of Jesus. And those who knew their Old Testament and knew those passages knew we're coming upon a new age. What had Jesus already been preaching? The kingdom of heaven is at hand. Repent. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. So that was a sign talking about the work of the Messiah, that He would open the eyes of the blind. And Jesus let them know that they were blind. The religious leaders who were rejecting Him were blind. He had said this before. You look at Matthew chapter 15. Matthew chapter 15. Jesus offended a prominent Jewish denomination there in the days of Christ called the Pharisees. He said in verse 7, He called them hypocrites. Verse 12, His disciples came and said, do you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard these sayings? Please understand this. Jesus offended a religious group in the days of Jerusalem called the Pharisees. He said they were hypocrites. Look at verse 13 and 14. He did not apologize. He said, every plant that my heavenly Father has not planted will be uprooted. Let them alone. They are blind leaders of the blind, and if the blind leads the blind, both will fall into a ditch. Jesus said that they were hypocrites in verse 7. He said in verse 13 that they were a plant that did not come from God. And He said they are blind. And everyone knew exactly who He was talking about. And so, when a person's blind, they don't seek another blind person to guide them. You don't want to do that. What good would that do? You'll both fall into the ditch. That's what Jesus is saying. And their blindness was a self-imposed blindness. And you find that in the book of Acts as well. If you turn to Acts chapter 7. Stephen is preaching here. Stephen says in verse 56, look, I see heaven open and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. Verse 57, they cried out with a loud voice and stopped their ears and ran at Him with one accord. They stopped their ears. It says, we don't want to hear it anymore. It was a self-imposed blindness. And Jesus is saying in John chapter 9 that this judgment I've come into the world, verse 39, that those who do not see may see. Those who are humble enough to say, I'm blind, I need guidance, they will be able to see. But those religious people who would not submit to the will of Jesus Christ are those who are made blinder, so to speak. Have you ever heard the saying, no one is so blind as he who will not see? Who will not see. It's not that they can't see, they will not see. And so Jesus here is talking about this. I have come to guide those who are humble enough, who are meek, who are poor in spirit, who recognize their spiritual blindness. He says, I am the light of the world, verse 5. And if you have that humble attitude and say, I need guidance, I need to know the way of the Lord, Jesus said, I will guide you. The Pharisees said, no, we don't need that. We are Moses' disciples. They're blind. They're blind. And you can't do anything with a person like that who's self-blind. They've selfishly blinded themselves, and they just will not see the truth. Now, a person can change their attitude and be willing to see the truth later on in life, if God grants them time. They can have their eyes open later on in life, or at a later date, but there has to be a humbleness to be able to say that. There has to be that attitude of humility. I'm blind. I need someone to guide me. Yes. Right. He came down very hard on the Pharisees, and there was no mistaking Matthew 23 who he was talking about. He called their names. So we've got to understand that is something that is done not out of hatred, not out of despisement, but out of love. That if it's done in love, it's got to be done. John chapter 10. Any questions or comments about that? John chapter 10, you get into some of the most beautiful imagery in the book of John concerning Christ's relationship to His people. And this kind of goes along, we probably won't get to the verses 27 through 30, but it kind of goes along with my lesson this morning of God's special covenant love with His people, and how that His people receive blessings that people of the world do not have, even though God loves everyone. He talks about Himself being the good shepherd. Again, this goes back to the concept of needing guidance. What does Isaiah 53 say? I can't think of the verse offhand, but Isaiah 53 says, we all like sheep have gone astray. We've sinned. We need a shepherd to guide us. Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd. And so, again, going along with that concept of being the light of the world, Jesus is going to be talking about Himself as the door, verse 9, and the good shepherd. And so we'll get to those verses. Look at verse 1. Most assuredly I say to you, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs up some other way, the same is a thief and a robber. You know, someone that's climbing over the fence doesn't have the sheep's best interest in mind. You know, I mean, you can apply that to any domesticated animal. You got somebody climbing over the fence. They're not going in the proper way. They're climbing over the fence. That's not a good sign. Verse 2. But he who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. Verse 3. To him the doorkeeper opens, and the sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. We're told that shepherds, not like the shepherds in our part of the country and other places where they are driven by sheepdogs. In ancient cultures, in some places in the Middle East, the shepherd leads the sheep. Doesn't drive them, but leads them and calls them by name. And the sheep recognize their shepherd's name, or the shepherd's voice. They recognize that voice. There's a special relationship there. He calls them and leads them out. Verse 4. When He brings out His own, notice that, His own, He goes before them, and the sheep follow Him, for they know His voice. Beautiful imagery there of the shepherd going to the pen. The doorkeeper opens the door, and He's leading them out. Calls them by name. The sheep recognize the shepherd's voice, and they follow Him because they know Him. And I want you to notice it's a continual following. It's a continuation of following. That'll become more important when we get to verses 27 through 30. Verse 5, yet they will by no means follow a stranger, but will flee from him, for they do not know the voice of strangers. Someone could come up and call them, even call their names, but they won't listen because they don't recognize His voice. Special relationship there. Verse 6, Jesus used this illustration, but they did not understand the things which He spoke to them. Well, if the context is flowing from chapter 9, why don't they understand it? Verse 41. If you were blind, you would have no sin. But now you say, we see, therefore your sin remains. And so they're blinded. That's why they don't get what Jesus is talking about. They're blinded. But Jesus is using imagery that's found all throughout the Old Testament as God being the shepherd of Israel. We already mentioned Psalm 23, probably the most well-known psalm of all. The Lord is my shepherd. Other passages that talk about Jesus, God being the shepherd of Israel, all throughout the Psalms and the prophets. Beautiful language there. Jesus is applying that to Himself. Verse 7. Jesus said to them again, most assuredly I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. Verse 8. All who ever came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not hear them. I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture. Now when Jesus says, I am the door, He's not talking about something like that. He's not talking about a door like that. He's talking about how the shepherd, in the evening time, after they would get the sheep back in the pen, the shepherd would stay in the entrance of the pen, and He is literally the door. No one can get into that pen except through Him, unless He allows them in to the pen. He literally sleeps in that area. He stays there with His staff and protects that area. And no one's going to get into that unless they go through the shepherd. So that's what He's saying. I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture. John 14 and verse 6, I am the way, the truth, the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. And verse 10, the thief does not come except to steal, to kill, and to destroy. I have come that they might have life, and that they might have it more abundantly. The thief, which most likely refers to the false prophets and the false messiahs that were running around at that time, that you even read about in the book of Acts, they had nothing but their own self-interest in mind. They want a following. Jesus said, I have come to give my sheep life, and that they might have it more abundantly. And that word abundant life refers to a life that's overflowing. The imagery is you're pouring water or some liquid into a cup, and the cup keeps overflowing. That's the type of life that Christ came to give His people. It's an overflowing life. Again, back to Psalm 23. My cup overflows. That overflowing life. And it's a continuous overflowing life. Jesus came to give us a life that's worth living, that's overflowing with blessings, And He said, this is the reason that I have come. Verse 11, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd gives his life for the sheep. The good shepherd will lay down his life so the sheep might live. And so Jesus is talking about here giving His life for the sheep. And notice, it's a voluntary laying down of His life. When they arrested Him and beat Him and crucified Him, it was voluntary. He did it out of love. And so that the sheep might have life. We'll continue our study of John chapter 10 next week. We'll be studying chapter 10.